So before I share my screen, I just want to say a couple of words of introduction. This class is actually one I'm really kind of a cover performer here today. It comes from Rabbi Ethan Tucker, who is a Harvard alum and one of the founders of what's now called the Hadar Institute in New York City. Rav Eitan is brilliant. I have his permission to give over this class. Since I heard it maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I've taught it on a number of occasions to students. It's a bit complex. If you've never studied Talmud before, you're going to have to hold a bit in your mind. But not to worry, there's some real broader issues that are going to be addressed also, and we'll summarize some of the main points. And even if you don't follow all of the technical details, you'll be okay too, because you'll still be able to get a lot out of the lesson, I think. And I just also one preliminary announcement. Next week, unfortunately, won't be meeting. We'll be hosting a separate program at the same time. Tal Becker is one of the lawyers who defended Israel at The Hague. He's been a long time advisor in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Israel. And we're hosting an interview program with him and kind of the speaker series that I also run in parallel to this. Happens to be because he's in Israel and because he's very busy. That's the only time he can make it. So yeah, if you want to attend that, and I think you'll really enjoy that, you have to register for that separately. But just a note that next Wednesday we won't be studying together, and we'll pick up again the following Wednesday. Okay, so I will share my screen here. I think it's always fun once you're an adult when you can have kind of images and doodles as part of a intellectual class. But I'll describe that in a moment. But basically what we've been talking about over the past few weeks is we started a number of weeks ago with this question of false prophecy and how we find truth. And we took an approach that said that conformity or consensus actually can be a sign of lack of truth. That's because we're all kind of embedded in our own life experiences and our own perspectives. And that's actually wonderful because since our own perspectives are limited, we need to encounter other people in order to get a broader understanding of ultimate truth. And then last week, we discussed a bit about some of the challenges and limitations of having conversations across difference when if we're all kind of embedded within our own perspectives on the nature of some limits of language. But today we're actually going to be thinking about this in a real practical way, which is given that we do come at things from different perspectives, so we see the world differently, that then leads to us having different beliefs, different understandings, and then we have to interact with people who hold those divergent views. And a lot of challenges arise in kind of the micro level and the macro level in dealing with those. And so we're going to take a look today at a model for dealing with that kind of difference. And in order to do so, we're going to begin with some definitions. And these might not be the ways that you have defined these terms in the past, but I still think they're very helpful. And again, this comes from Rabbi Ethan or Eitan Tucker. And I just realized I'm not yet live streaming this. So give me 1 second to make sure that I put this onto Facebook. I'm glad I got this just in time. Okay. So the first definition that we're going to begin with is this notion of integrity. And for Rav Eitan, he defines integrity really as always fighting for a particular value. So if you really hold something to be deeply true, you then would want to see that value play itself out wherever you have an ability to affect other people living by that value. And one example for this comes from the Tosefta, which is a collection of Tannaitic literature of the ancient rabbis. And there we read the following. A Jew, and this is down over here, we're going to bounce back and forth a bit for the first couple of sources. A Jew may not hand over a limb torn from a live animal to a Gentile. So first of all, what's going on here, right? We believe that there are 7 fundamental laws that all of humanity is required to observe. And one of them includes not eating the limb from a live animal, Aver Mina Chai. So here, if I meet someone who wants this animal, this limb torn from a live animal, I can't give it to them because they're not permitted to eat it. And a somewhat related general principle, though, is nor can one give a cup of wine to a Nazir, to a Nazirite, which is an oath that one could take, which prohibits a few things, including drinking wine. And why is this? For the general principle that one may not feed a person that which is forbidden to them. Now, it's a little strange in terms of how we think of a Nazir, because a Nazir probably, if someone's already taking that vow, they've kind of bought into the same general Jewish system. But for a non-Jew, it seems as if they may have a completely different worldview. They don't believe in Jewish principles. So therefore, they might not believe that they're bound by this prohibition from eating from a live animal. And as a result, we're saying that even though I have my perspective, which might be that no one's allowed to eat a limb from a live animal, and they have a different perspective, nevertheless, I am not allowed to enable them to live even according to their own perspective. And that's a sense of integrity, that I believe that no one can do this, and therefore I am not going to enable anyone to do it. And I think this goes even further to some extent, which is not just about enabling, but actually in some ways preventing someone else from doing something which they may not believe in, but you do. And that's the mitzvah of tochacha, of rebuke. And we read in Parshat Kedoshim in Leviticus, you shall surely rebuke your kin, your brother, your neighbor. And the way that the Talmud understands this is, from where is it derived with regard to one who sees an unseemly matter in another person, that he is obligated to rebuke them. As it is stated, you shall rebuke, hocheach tochiach, your neighbor. If one rebuked them for this action, but this person did not accept the rebuke, from where is it derived that one must rebuke them again? Because the verse says, you shall rebuke, or you shall surely rebuke, hocheach tochiach. It's double language of the same root. And the double language indicates that one must rebuke in any case. So the fact that the Torah seems to have the superfluous doubling of the word is meant to teach us that even if someone kind of rebuffs your own rebuke, you still have to press them. And seemingly, if someone's rebuffing your initial rebuke, it's because they don't really care. And nevertheless, because you hold that value to be a value, it's incumbent on you, for your own integrity, to do your best to force that upon somebody else. Now, please don't take this as practical advice. There are other considerations when offering someone rebuke, and for the most part, we actually rarely rebuke somebody else because they're not going to be able to hear it, and that we don't know how to offer the rebuke in the proper terminology. But in principle, one would rebuke somebody else, which again is the actualization of this understanding of integrity, that you fight for a value because it's a value, and you want to do so in every circumstance where you can, even with someone else who doesn't buy into the same system as you. So that is Rabbi Tucker's understanding of integrity. Now there is pluralism. His definition of pluralism is that we at least tolerate, maybe even celebrate different practices or beliefs, right? So a sense of live and let live. I do my thing, you do your thing. At the very least, I'm not going to interfere with you. And maybe even I'm going to celebrate that and hold that up in some way. And I think the classic example of this in rabbinic text is about Hillel and Shammai, the two sort of ancient rabbis and schools of thought. We read in the Talmud in Tractate of Eruvin, Rabbi Abba said in the name of Shmuel, for 3 years, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai argued. One said the halacha is like this, the Jewish law is like us, is like this. And the other said, no, it's actually like us. And then eventually a heavenly voice spoke and said, these and these are the words of the living God. Elu va'elu divrei Elohim Chaim. Both of these are actually the words of the living God, even though they're contradictory. And the halacha is like the house of Hillel. So the first part of that verse is itself very powerful. It's an assertion of things that we've seen already. This notion that even ideas that might be mutually exclusive or contradictory actually are both facets of the ultimate divine truth. Nevertheless, it becomes somewhat interesting then, so why does the halacha follow the position of Hillel? And the answer is, a question was raised, since the heavenly voice declared both these and these are the words of the living God, why was the halacha established to follow the opinion of Hillel? And the answer, it is because the students of Hillel were kind and gracious. They taught their own ideas as well as the ideas from the students of Shammai. Not only for this reason, but they went so far as to teach Shammai's opinions first. So what you have here really is an expression, I think, of pluralism. Even if at the end of the day, the law is meant to follow Hillel, the whole reason it follows Hillel is because they perpetuate the debate. Because when they get up to teach, in theory, if their whole goal was to have full integrity and just to suppress any other opinion, why would they mention the position of Shammai? But instead, even in their own teaching, they're elevating multiple perspectives. And this really then is this position or notion of pluralism. And then they went even further to describe or to quote Shammai first, give them some element of respect there. Now, practically speaking, it does seem like we hold the law like Hillel. Nevertheless, that might be true kind of for the broader sort of rabbinic community. But it's probably the case that actually the specific independent schools of Hillel and Shammai could follow their own school's way of thinking. And this has actually perpetuated itself well into many years past the Talmud of this notion of halachic pluralism. And you'll find that many halachic scholars throughout the generations hold views that say that basically it's fine for there to be one practice in our community and another in another community, so long as the process of deciding was itself followed in each distinct community. And the Talmud actually says in some place that someone who always follows the house of Shammai, who tended to be strict, is foolish, and someone who always follows the house of Hillel, tended to be lenient, is wicked. Because you're meant to follow a specific school of thought and not just choose based on what's easier, in which case you're kind of a bit lazy in some ways, or just what's harder because you're then being overly harsh. And Pirkei Avot, in a very nice and succinct statement, says, every argument that is for the sake of heaven's name is destined to endure. But if it's not for the sake of heaven's name, it is not destined to endure. And what is an example of such an argument in the name of heaven? It's the argument of Hillel and Shammai. And so we have really fundamental to the Jewish rabbinic tradition is this notion of pluralism, of a multiplicity of ideas that are valid. And even in the terminology here, they are the living truth of God. And I think that's really important. And that's also why so much, I think, in the Jewish tradition, there's an element of pluralism and debate, because we're constantly holding multiple perspectives and learning contradictory perspectives as well. And in some ways, I think this is a bit countercultural to what we see a bit on the academic sort of scene today, where there does seem to be more of a move towards orthodoxy, really just have one view that conquers, and dissenting opinions are not really tolerated. Anyway, though, that's the second of our core ways that we may think about dealing with difference. We mentioned integrity. We always fight for what you believe. Pluralism is this kind of live and let live. And then finally, we have this definition that comes from Rav Eitan of community. And the way he defines community is allowing yourself to be vulnerable to and dependent on decisions and practices of someone else. We're not really going to have a text here to describe this, so he uses this notion of Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lezeh. All Jews are guarantors for one another. We are literally bound up with each other. And this can play out in a whole host of some that might be large-scale issues and some that might be smaller-scale issues, right? If you are from a community that believes in patrilineal descent, right, that Jewish identity can be passed from a father to a child, then if you try and be in community with someone who believes that it's only matrilineal, comes from the mother, well, who are you then going to count, let's say, in a prayer quorum? That's where if you decide to be in community, you're going to be subject to and vulnerable to the decisions that someone else has made. On a smaller level, this can play itself out, let's say, in a synagogue that wants to be welcoming to children, in which case it might be loud and disruptive, and other people in the community who would like to have a much more quiet, focused prayer, right? So if you're going to be in community with each other, well, if you want to have that focused prayer, you have to subject yourself to the noise of the children, and perhaps simultaneously, if you're the child or the parent of a child, right, and you're in community with someone or a group of people who want to have that more focused prayer, you may also have to say, take your children out at some moments from the service. Ways in which, by being in community, you are subject to and vulnerable to the decisions of others. Now, Rabbi Tucker claims is that when dealing with difference, we have to choose. We can never have all three of these different kind of pillars on this triangle at the same time. If you have true integrity, there's no way to also have pluralism, because you're going to have to, you can't sort of have this live and let live situation. But you might kind of position yourself here where you have integrity to a decent extent, and then you close yourself off from other people. And so you kind of have the live and let live, but you're really also mostly integral, because in your own sort of sphere, you can do as you believe. And then some examples I've already given in terms of community where that's not pluralism, or in the case of what I just mentioned before with the prayer service, you may have, the two different services, one which is only for people who can be quiet, and one which is really open for children. Actually, once heard, I don't know if this is actually true or it lasted very long, that El Al had special flights that were geared towards people with children, because a lot of people don't like to be on flights with kids who are running around and screaming, and they'd even have like a clown on the plane to kind of make it entertaining. Various ways that we can be engaged with one another. Okay, so now we're gonna look at imagine for most people here, a novel sugya, or exploration of an idea in the Talmud, which is going to be a little bit tricky, so I'm warning you in advance. But we're going to move through it somewhat swiftly, and I'll summarize. And this will, I think, lead to some interesting ways that the rabbis considered how we'll deal with difference. In order to understand that piece of Talmud, we first need some background. So the first idea that we need to understand is the notion of Yibum, of Levirate marriage. So in ancient Israel, and this is true, I believe, actually in a lot of ancient Near East civilizations, if a man died and had no children, then his wife, or now widow, would marry his brother. And then the two, when they would have a child together, would name them after or have a son, would name them after the deceased. And that was a way of kind of perpetuating that deceased man's legacy. Now, this idea, in theory, could still exist today, although we don't really practice this. One exception actually is a distant cousin of mine was a Holocaust survivor, and basically, so this is my grandmother's brother was murdered by the Nazis and left behind a wife. He actually had a baby, but the baby was also killed. And years later, his widow married his brother. Neither of them could find love. They're both sort of stuck in sorrow, and they were able to bond over that. And I think it was suggested to them that this would be a way to fulfill actually this ancient notion of Yibum. But typically, we don't actually do that nowadays. So again, a man dies without children. His widow marries his brother. Now, if they choose not to go through with that Yibum, with that Levirate marriage, they perform a ritual called chalitza, and it's kind of a form of divorce. It's its own special ritual. It's not a full kind of divorce, but it's basically a way of saying that we are now partially bounded to each other, but we're not going to go through with this. Instead, we are going to part ways. So Yibum is the act of them getting married. Chalitza is the act of them separating. Again, this is the widow and the brother of the deceased. Now, a couple of other important notions. So one is that priests, Kohanim, are prohibited from marrying a few different types of women, one of which is a divorcee, and another is also a woman who has had certain illicit relations. And also, if that woman had such a relationship that was prohibited and then had daughters, and this perpetuates for multiple generations, those daughters are not allowed to marry priests either. Another important category, which you may have heard of in the past, a mamzer, typically translated as a bastard, but I'm just going to use the term mamzer here, which is a child that is conceived by specific illicit sexual relationships. And really, those are incest or adultery. And so a mamzer is not allowed to marry most other Jews. They can marry converts and they can marry other mamzers. You should know that in kind of practical, in a practical way, there are almost never any cases of mamzer. So even if one can basically pretty much know that a child was conceived, let's say, in an adulterous relationship, we tend to find ways to create doubt such that that won't actually be the case for the child. A lot of these ideas in practice, are not implemented exactly as they might appear, and we may be sort of troubled by some of these or not. And so I just want to make sure that I validate that. But at least in the Talmud itself, this is really going to be a discussion of these ideas that lead to larger, broader values. So I would encourage you, if you're disturbed by some of these notions, don't get hung up on that. That's not the point of this particular class. And that can be a conversation for another time, but you'll be able to then still understand the broader principles that are at play here. And the last important point here is that this notion of a levirate marriage, right, when the husband dies and the wife has to marry the brother, does not happen in a case where the widow is related in some way to her brother-in-law that she is now supposed to marry. And we'll get into one specific example of this case. So I'm going to do this via a diagram, and I hope that this is helpful. So you have in the center this first brother. This is the one who is gonna die in this circumstance, and he is married to two wives. We no longer practice polygamy, but as you're aware, if you read Tanakh, if you read the Torah, certainly that was part of Jewish life for a long time. So you have here this man, brother one, who has two wives. I'm just going to call the one on the left co-wife. And what's also unusual about this circumstance is that one of his wives is his niece. So that's not an incestuous relationship, according to the Torah. A man is not allowed to marry their aunt, but may marry their niece. I'm not encouraging this. I'm just saying that is what the technical Jewish law is. So when brother one dies without children, okay, in order to effectuate levirate marriage, brother two is supposed to marry his wives, brother one's wives. Now, he's not allowed to marry his daughter. That's out of the question. Down here, he is not going to marry this woman. That's not even in question because he's related to her and it's an illicit relationship. Fine. But what about this other woman over here? Okay. He's not related to her. So in theory, he should marry her. But this becomes a debate between Hillel and Shammai, and we'll see the text itself in a moment. But basically, Shammai says they should proceed as normal. This woman is not related to him, so the brother should go through with this levirate marriage. Hillel, on the other hand, says this is a little bit too close to home. Brother one was married to this man's daughter, and they kind of shared some kind of home, right? There was however that works, the polygamous relationship, they kind of shared this home. And because brother two is connected to his own daughter, it's really too close to home for him to also marry this other woman, even though he's not actually related to her. So that's the debate between Hillel and Shammai. And we're going to see that in this text in the Mishnah in Yevamot, which says as follows. Beit Shammai permits the co-wives to the brothers for marriage, but Beit Hillel forbids them. If these women had performed chalitza, which is again this kind of divorce for a levirate marriage, Beit Shammai disqualifies them from subsequently marrying priests or kohanim. Why is this the case? Because for Beit Shammai, this marriage was supposed to take place. It's perfectly valid. They're granted permitted to not go through with it. So they go through chalitza. And now they're essentially considered as if they're divorced. And a divorcee is not allowed to marry a kohen, a priest. But Beit Hillel says they are allowed to marry a priest. Why? Because for Beit Hillel, this marriage was never actually required. This levirate marriage wasn't required because, again, it's too close for comfort. And just going back up to our diagram, brother two is essentially kind of related, we're saying, to co-wife one, and therefore he should not marry her, in which case the whole principle of levirate marriage, of yibum, does not even apply. And if it doesn't apply, they don't even have to go through chalitza. And so if they go through this chalitza, again, which is a kind of divorce for this specific case, it's a completely superfluous ritual, in which case she's not actually considered like she's divorced. And so she can go ahead and marry a Kohen. Now, what happens if these women actually went through Yibum and they carried out the marriage, right? So brother two actually marries co-wife of brother one. Well, according to Beit Shammai, it's great. They're fulfilling this mitzvah of Yibum. They're going through with this. So that's fine. And now if this man subsequently dies, right, meaning brother two also dies, well, she's now considered a widow twice over. It's obviously very sad, but she is not considered a divorcee. She can go ahead and marry a Kohen in the future. But Beit Hillel disqualifies this relationship because for Beit Hillel, she was not supposed to marry brother two. And the fact that they went through this is actually an incestuous relationship. Oh, by the way, the reason for this, I should have mentioned, is that outside of the context of Yibum, a brother is not allowed to marry his brother's wife. So meaning if a man dies and he's had children, Yibum doesn't apply. Brother two is prohibited as an incestuous relationship for marrying his brother's former wife. So in this case, right, this was an illicit relationship, and they are no longer, she cannot marry a Kohen, a priest. I'm going to go through a little bit more here. We'll see a chart that summarizes this, and then we're going to see some interesting things. So hopefully you're following, but even if you're not, the broader principles will still be, you'll be able to follow those. So the Tosefta in Yevamot then says the following. It says, if a co-wife marries a man other than the lever, meaning this other brother, and hasn't performed chalitza, that's a problem according to Beit Shammai. And Beit Shammai now says their child is disqualified from marrying a Kohen because that's an illicit relationship. It's essentially a form of adultery. And so their child cannot marry a Kohen. It's not quite adultery, but it's close to it. Beit Hillel says their child is totally fine. What are you talking about? Because of this relationship, he wasn't supposed to marry this widow anyway. And as a result, he's perfectly appropriate for him to go and it's appropriate for her to go and marry someone else. And so any future children are perfectly valid children. If a wife consummates the levirate marriage, Beit Shammai says their child is valid because they were supposed to do this, and so they should marry other Jews. But Beit Hillel says, no, that's actually a form of a prohibited relationship because they're not supposed to do Yibum, and therefore the child is considered a mamzer, and therefore invalid to marry other Jews. We have a chart here which outlines the cases we have just seen. I don't actually want to go through this again because hopefully you've gotten it. If you haven't, again, you're going to be okay, but this is there for you for reference. But the big question now emerges is that, okay, you have Beit Hillel has their perspective, Beit Shammai has their perspective. We have disagreements all the time in Jewish law, as we've seen before. Except in this case, we get into some really kind of tricky practical circumstances of how someone who followed Hillel can actually be in relationship with someone maybe who follows the school of Shammai and vice versa. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, if one fulfills the words of Beit Shammai and allows the co-wife to marry the brother, the lever, then according to Beit Hillel, that child is a mamzer, as we just saw. And if one fulfills the word of Beit Hillel and allows the co-wife to marry another man without performing chalitza, the child is now tainted according to Beit Shammai and can't marry a Kohen. So this now leads to a problem. people who are in the camp of Beit Shammai will look at how people who followed the positions of Beit Hillel and say, wait a second, in certain circumstances, I can't marry those people because they are products of some illicit relationship according to my perspective, even though they followed properly their own perspective, and vice versa. So this is where we get to this question of dealing with difference, because these two schools of thought will lead to various people not being able to marry one another. So what does Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri suggest? He says, let us ordain that co-wives should always perform chalitza and never marry the leaver. And just to explain what that means, right? Here's the case. The brother dies, brother one dies. What's supposed to happen? Brother two and co-wife of brother one, what do? Well, according to Beit Hillel, nothing. They're free. They shouldn't get married, and they're free to go about their lives independently because the Levirate marriage is not applicable here. According to Beit Shammai, they are supposed to get married, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, fine, just let them perform chalitza and do this divorce, and then everyone can go on their separate ways. And I guess the answer would then be, and not marry a Kohen also. So this actually is a decent practical solution, but as we see, it prioritizes community because now each camp has to make themselves vulnerable to the decisions of the other camp. Beit Hillel has to consider what Beit Shammai believes in moving forward, and Beit Shammai has to consider what Beit Hillel believes. But there's also some form of pluralism that exists here as well, because there's a sense of Beit Hillel is kind of doing their own thing and Beit Shammai is kind of doing their own thing, and we are validating each of the different perspectives. But what is lost is this question of integrity, because again, going back up to our diagram, according to Beit Hillel, chalitza does not need to be performed, and yet they are performing chalitza. So this may not seem like, in which chalitza again is this kind of divorce, and this might not seem like this is a big kind of infringement on one's own integrity, but it is compromising it to some extent. Beit Hillel saying, all right, we'll go ahead and we will perform this unnecessary ritual just to satisfy Beit Shammai. And Beit Shammai on the same kind of token is going to say, in theory, it's probably a good thing that the brother marries this wife. That's what the Torah in some ideal world wants, even though they're permitted to not go through with it. The fact that we're going to require this kind of divorce, that's also a compromise. So there's an element of giving over of one's integrity for the sake of being in community together. And to some extent, there's at least an implicit validation of the other perspective. So there is a certain kind of pluralism. Okay, so that's one approach. But then there's a very, very surprising separate approach. We read the following. Said Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, what should be done for the co-wives of earlier generations who already followed the practice of Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel? Think about what's happening here. This might be a lovely solution in some ways that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri has come up with, but it's too little too late. There have already been people in the camp, the community of Beit Hillel, who have gone through with the Beit Hillel formula, and people in the camp of Beit Shammai who have done the same thing. And because these statuses of either being a mamzer or either being differently prohibited from marrying a Kohen perpetuate through multiple generations, the fact that now we're going to say, just let everyone go through this kind of divorce and not actually marry the lever. But there have been previous generations where they've done this. So what should they do? And here is the solution. Even though Beit Shammai disagreed with Beit Hillel about the co-wives, Beit Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Beit Hillel, nor Beit Hillel from marrying the people from Beit Shammai. Rather, they practiced truth and peace with each other, as it says, love, truth, and peace. So this is actually rather surprising, because if you're in the camp of Beit Hillel, right, there are circumstances where the camp of Beit Shammai has followed a certain set of Jewish law that has led to children being mamzers, which according to the Torah, most of the people in the Beit Hillel camp should not be marrying these mamzers. They're prohibited to them. And yet, the solution here is to say, you know what? They did anyway. And it happens in the reverse position also, that members of the camp of Beit Shammai look at the school of Beit Hillel and say, we can't marry you because according to our understanding of the law, those children are prohibited. And yet it seems as if, again, from this notion of they practice truth and peace with each other, they still went ahead and marry one another. And what does this then mean? This then means that if we look back at our chart of these three different ways of dealing with difference, integrity, pluralism, and community, what we see is integrity is definitely not upheld here, right? Beit Hillel now even instructs its own children to kind of go against the official position of Beit Hillel, so integrity gets lost. In many ways, there's not really pluralism either, because pluralism is where you allow the other person's perspective to kind of live and flourish and yours on its own. So what is left is really just community, right? You allow yourself, the school of Beit Hillel allows itself to be vulnerable to the school of Beit Shammai and vice versa in a pretty dramatic and radical way. Now, Rabbi Shimon adds a minor tweak to this. He says they did not refrain from doubtful cases, but they did refrain from certain cases. What that means is if someone knew that their great-great-grandmother had been in this situation, right, and you're in the school of Beit Shammai, you might not marry this person you know is for sure the great-great-granddaughter of someone in the school of Beit Hillel, which would be problematic for your perspective. But if they didn't really know, they just had some suspicion that someone was a descendant in this way, they would practice this thing and marry each other, but not in a case where they knew with absolute certainty. But I think the fundamental principle here still holds, which is really quite radical, that the school of Beit Hillel allows itself to be subject to the decisions of Beit Shammai in a way which deeply compromises their own perspective of what is right and correct. Okay, so that is the second way that this might be dealt with. A third way that this might be dealt with is each group told one another, meaning the school of Beit Hillel and the school of Beit Shammai. Often when I do this with students, I kind of just use Harvard Hillel and Yale Hillel, right? Because people love the Harvard Yale dichotomy there, or rivalry. So basically, the school of Beit Hillel would inform the members of the community of Beit Shammai which of these women they should be concerned about, that or the offspring, meaning, and vice versa as well. So basically what it says is, Beit Hillel would say, I think these women can marry everyone, but I know that you, Beit Shammai, you believe that this is actually a problem for you, so I'm going to let you know about that. And this would happen in the reverse case as well. So this then, I think, is really prioritizing integrity and pluralism. Basically, each side is saying, I'm going to live the life in the way that I believe the law to be decided, but I'm going to allow the other community to kind of do its own thing, and I'm going to give them whatever information I know that they need in order to live according to the way that they see things as fit. One final perspective on this, which is very similar to the one which we've seen just before, states the following: even though Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed about the co-wives, Beit Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Beit Hillel, nor Beit Hillel from Beit Shammai. This is the idea we saw before. Rather, they practice truth and peace, as it says, love, truth, and peace. But now what does the Talmud say there? The Talmud says, are you kidding me? Mamzerut, this notion of mamzers, of people who are not supposed to get married with most of these other Jews, is at stake. And you're just going to so glibly say, all right, they just love truth and peace. Do you understand what's really at stake here? And so then the Talmud then concludes by saying, Rabbi Yosef Bar Rabban said Rav and Shmuel disagreed. One said they both followed the halacha, meaning that they each actually decided like Beit Hillel, and in this case, Beit Hillel just conquers Beit Shammai. And one said these followed their halacha, and these followed their halacha, which again is the pluralistic approach. But again, the Talmud just says, but you still have mamzerut at stake, and you're going to say that. And then the final perspective here is God watched over them, and a case that would have produced a problem of mamzerut never arose. So there's a way here which you might dismiss this as being sort of working out a little too easily. But I think there's, at least in kind of a literary way, there's a beauty here, which is that by prioritizing this notion of peace and being in community, yes, it leads to some problems, but ultimately we can kind of leave that up to God to kind of make sure that those things kind of work out. But I do think that there is sort of on the more fundamental level, I like to bring this at the end. The earlier source that we saw, I think, is actually more powerful. The one that just says that they subjected themselves to one another, the positions of one another. And to recap, and we'll go back to our little triangle over here, right? We basically have a case, and we're going to try and abstract this now a little bit more. So we don't have to get sort of bogged down in the details of Hillel and Shammai. But basically, you have a case where people who follow the position of Beit Hillel could not live in full consonance with the people who followed the position of Beit Shammai. And so the different options were either to kind of a more pluralistic approach, or pluralism and integrity, which is great. We'll kind of just divide ourselves, live separate lives to the extent that we have to here. And the school of Shammai can do their thing. The school of Hillel can do their thing, uphold their own integrity, and just live in separate communities. That was one perspective. And this other is that we really deeply, radically expose ourselves to the decisions of the other, such that Beit Hillel will actually have to allow people to get married within their community that they, in theory, really do not think should be getting married, because they want to be in community with the house of Beit Shammai, and vice versa. And then we did also see this one view, which is that kind of pure integrity, which is that the position of Beit Hillel just completely conquered the position of Beit Shammai. Now, I think there are lots of ways in which this can play itself out. And we've seen this, or I gave an example at the start of the class about being a community where people make noise, with children around making noise, and other people want there to be a more focused prayer. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. But actually, these come up all the time, and they come up, I think, in many ways also in secular law. One example which I think was quite or this played itself out and actually shifted pretty quickly over time, had to do with gay marriage, right? So you may recall, if you go back not too long ago, probably in the early 2000s, right, that I think it was the Defense of Marriage Act, that there was a desire to actually have full integrity for the position that gay marriage could not be allowed anywhere in the United States, right? So the people who held that belief wanted to make sure that that was universally applied. Pure integrity, no room for pluralism, no real room for community as we've seen it. And then you actually shifted. There was a brief period of time. It didn't last very long, but I think George Bush wanted to have passed an amendment that would have banned gay marriage throughout the country. And then you ended up going right to a place of where each state actually got to decide. And there was, I believe, some period of time where some states permitted gay marriage and some states prohibited gay marriage, right? And then you moved to have the Supreme Court basically say that gay marriage, you could not prohibit gay marriage anywhere. So then you had a certain sense of full community, full integrity on the other side of the spectrum. So that's one example where these ideas, I think, can play themselves out. I think we're seeing that now again with questions of abortion. And so just to say that this is not a question of this very specific and niche Jewish law, which is both niche within Jewish law and is really no longer so applicable because we just always have everyone do chalitza and not carry through this levirate marriage. But I think really serves as a really broad frame for how we want to think about living with difference. And one of the reasons why I personally chose to work at a Hillel is because I love being in community with people who are different. And that actually allows for questions like this to come up all the time, right? All kinds of questions. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a rabbi at another Hillel. He didn't give me the full background, so I can't tell you all the details. So basically, there was a Reform student who felt that something about Kedem grape juice, right? And I didn't get the full story. I don't know if it was the certification or something. Was he said it was misogynist? Now again, I know no details here, so I can't sort of share that. But basically, this Reform student in their Hillel was on a campaign to ban Kedem grape juice from all of Hillel, right? Would not be allowed in any functions. And in contrast to that, something which actually happens a little more typically at most Hillels is some people will say, I keep kosher. I want every Hillel event to also be, according to my standard. And these communities have to constantly make those decisions. Can there be loud music being played in a Hillel on Shabbat when some people don't want there to be music being played? And others, that's actually part of their whole Shabbat experience, that there may be sort of a band and a more lively kind of Kabbalat Shabbat or other service. I'll say that at Harvard Hillel, the practice that we've had, for better or for worse, for years, is that in kind of all community sort of events that are made for the general community, we have what might seem as a fairly strict standard, let's say, when it comes to kashrut, which follows mostly an Orthodox practice. But we actually make clear exceptions for each of the different minyanim, because for each of the minyanim, we want them to be able to kind of live out in full their own values. So one time this came up not too long ago was for a break fast on after Yom Kippur a number of years ago. One of the minyanim wanted to do it at IHOP, and I remember some Orthodox students were very upset, and they said, how can Hillel sponsor an event right after Yom Kippur? People are going to eat in a restaurant that I believe is not kosher. And I was able to say to them, I understand you're standing up for this notion of integrity, as we've just seen, right? So that's what you're fighting for, or like this Reform student in this other Hillel fighting for their, the ban on Kedem grape juice. And I said, but our choice here is, you're right, we wouldn't have IHOP at an all Hillel function, but for this particular minyan, that's permitted because they get to decide for themselves their own level of religious practice. And so these issues come up all the time, and sometimes they're frustrating and challenging. I love them because I think we always end up, no matter how niche of a community we're in, we think we can avoid these questions and we can't, right? And you go to a board meeting basically of any shul, any synagogue, a ritual committee meeting of any synagogue, I guarantee you people will be fighting with each other. And from the outside, they might seem like the most narrow of debates, right? So if you compare the difference between the Orthodox minyan at Harvard Hillel and the Reform minyan, those might seem large, but if you go to a ritual committee meeting of the Orthodox minyan at Harvard Hillel, you will find there's a pretty heavy debate about things that from the outside, someone would say, I don't even understand what the issue is. And so I think these kinds of skills of how we think of being in community with people who are different from us are so crucial for all of us to be able to learn. They play themselves out on a civic level more broadly. And that's one of the reasons why I think Hillel is actually so important, not just for serving the immediate needs of Jewish students, that's obviously the case. I think for training students in a way of being that allows us to really learn how to live with diversity, because you cannot avoid that. I mean, families are the same way, right? And so the better capable we are at dealing with difference, I think it helps us in many different spheres. And this particular frame, I think, is just helpful for us to be able to kind of wrap our minds around what the different options are. And I think most importantly, to recognize that something has to, I think, be lost, that we can't actually uphold all of these things all of the time. And that's okay. And I think once we're aware that that's necessary, then that helps us, I think, be more willing to maximize what we can and make intentional decisions about which kind of points or legs of the triangle we want to uphold at different moments. I'm going to pause here, and I'll stop the recording. As I've said before, I think some people don't want to be on camera. That's totally legitimate.